So this piece will belong both to the desktop Ekphrasis series, and it will belong to a variety of sortings sorting series that we've been exploring recently, and this sorting in particular, this sorting for Mike Brown is a sorting of police violence by the racial biases of the criminal justice system in the United States. A 34-year-old man whose death was not the consequence of police violence, but the unfortunate and unintended result of an act of self-defense on the part of a police officer. A 26-year-old man whose death was not the result of police violence, but the unfortunate and unintended result of an act of self-defense on the part of 3 police officers. A 24-year-old man whose death was not the result of police violence, but the unfortunate and unintended result of an act of self-defense on the part of 5 police officers. A 23-year-old man whose death was not the intentional result of an act of police violence, but the unfortunate and unintended consequence of an act of self-defense on the part of 7 police officers. A 55-year-old man whose death was not the result and consequence of an assault by police officers, but the unintended and unfortunate result and consequence of an act in which several police officers defended themselves against the 55-year-old man. A 67-year-old man whose death was not the consequence of a police beating, but the unfortunate and unintended consequence of a previously diagnosed heart condition. A 62-year-old man whose death was not the consequence of a police assault, but of a traumatic brain injury sustained in some undefined and undisclosed incident of physical trauma. A 27-year-old woman whose death was not the consequence of police assault, but of injuries unidentified. In their origins, by the coroner performing her autopsy. A 13-year-old boy whose death was not the consequence of police violence, but of self-inflicted injuries sustained in the act of resisting arrest. A 27-year-old woman whose death was not the consequence of police violence, but of similar injuries sustained in the act of resisting police arrest. A 72-year-old man whose death was not the result and consequence of police violence, but of injuries sustained in the act of resisting arrest. A 16-year-old girl whose death was not the result and consequence of police violence, but of injuries sustained in the act of resisting arrest. A 23-year-old male whose death by hanging in an isolated cell was confirmed to be the result of suicide, whose causes relate to a long history of mental illness. And whose beatings at the hands of police had little or no bearing upon the actions directly involved in his death. A 24-year-old male who died of asphyxiation in a holding cell as a result of a previously diagnosed respiratory illness, not as a consequence of being held in an unbreathable space for the course of 72 hours, deprived of food, water, or air to breathe. A man who died of a previous condition, not of assault. A woman who died of a previous condition, not of gunshot. heart that failed, not a beating. An aneurysm, not a baton. A mental illness, not a violation. A resistance of arrest, not an attack. Being a criminal, not being black. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not being targeted. Being an unfortunate accident. Not being a person of color. Being the result of an unintended and unfortunate action. Not the subject of racial violence. Being a likely candidate of criminality. Not a person of color in the United States today. Being a mistaken identity. Being a mistaken identity. Being a mistaken identity. Being an accident. Being unfortunate. Being a misreading of a cell phone for a gun. Being a misreading of a wallet for a gun. Being a misreading of a criminal for Mike Brown.